Thank you.
There you go. While David is setting up the link, I would just also like to say a warm welcome from Machine Learning in Healthcare. This is not only our first remote event. Beginning of February, we actually started next to Machine Learning in Healthcare Berlin, also Machine Learning in Healthcare Budapest, which then was, and we were actually planning our first meetup for April. Of course, you all understand that this didn't really work out. So maybe some of them have also joined today. So that would be actually really nice if this would be the first meetup where people from both meetups are actually participating. Yeah, so our framework is called From Bit to Bedside, Practical Framework for Artificial Intelligence Product Development in Healthcare. Very long title, but basically everything is inside that you need to know. But I think we will give David a short introduction in the second slide, who's actually speaking and why did we do that?
Yeah, so I guess I'll jump in and say hi. So I think we have some video issues there. So my name is David Higgins, and I'm already having slide issues. So sorry about that. I'm the slide DJ. Vince is going to talk for the first part, and then we will alternate, and then I will finish. And hopefully I'll have my control over the slides by the time it's my turn to talk. So I have a background in computational modeling, an academic background, and I've been involved in starting 2 companies in this space so far. And right now I'm working at the Berlin Institute of Health as a mentor for quite a number of teams that are spinning out, and they're all developing various AI products for medicine or healthcare. And this article that we wrote is basically a summary of all of our learnings, both of us, over the past few years. So over to you, Vince.
Yes, so my background is in medicine, but I've never done any clinical work. I was doing lots of research in imaging, and then 4 years ago I started to completely nerdify myself by going into the machine learning space, including learning Python. And currently I'm a CSO of a university spin-off where we help others and develop ourselves products in AI in healthcare, and also at the Charité. Our group is also focusing on developing products for the treatment of stroke and to spin that out. So as David just said, we shared a lot of experiences regarding the development of AI healthcare products, and then we put them together. Maybe as a disclaimer first, it's a 30-page paper, and we of course can give here only a very, very high-level overview of what we've been doing. So this is really just a teaser, giving you an idea what is important in the framework, and we would really ask if you're really interested then to really read the paper, and you find the link throughout the presentation at several time points. I think we can go to the first or the next slide, Dave. Thank you. So what was basically, why do we even develop new products for healthcare? It's basically a very, very high level question. And there are several challenges in our healthcare systems. And one of the big challenges that we're facing is that healthcare costs are increasing a lot. Now, why is that? Next slide, please. Why are healthcare costs increasing so much? So one is we have aging populations. Aging populations means more people that are older. Being older means, unfortunately, age is one of really the unmodifiable risk factors that we have for many, many, many different diseases. Aging population really means that we have a really big strain on our healthcare systems, caring for these or treating all these diseases that can pop up with old age. Next slide. Next to that, medicine is really getting better. We're getting better at treating diseases. We find more and more therapies for new diseases. And unfortunately, some of these therapies are really, really expensive. So now this is an extreme example, of course, but there's since last year a drug that literally costs $2 million per per dose, $2 million per dose. So this, of course, again shows that next to the aging population, we also have increasing costs just by becoming better at treating patients. Next slide, please. So we have fortunately now a method, and AI is basically, and this is important also for the framework, it's a method. We have a method which has the promise that we can actually reduce costs and at the same time increase the quality of care. This really sounds like a very big promise, but I think everyone who is working in the field knows this is, at least in theory, possible. But, here comes next slide, a big but. If you actually look at what's happening, next slide, this is the big but, where are the actual products? If you really look at, so how many actually certified, clinically, with proven clinical benefit, products, certified products with proven clinical benefit are actually used right now today in the clinical setting? If you look closely, basically, I would say almost none, although I think it's actually none, because even those which are available are often not really clinically proven. They might have gone through regulation, but really the clinically proven benefit that you would ask a clinician and say, yeah, of course, of course, for this particular question, we always use AI system X. That's the standard of care. There is no product like that as far as I know, or maybe there are one or two. I'm sorry if I missed them, but it's really not a lot. And why is this? And this is basically that was the main problem that both David and I identified. And for the next slide, please, is that we have this gap. What we see and what you hear about, these are all proof of concept. So I found, just when I made this, I found again, this from January, AI system is better than human doctors at predicting breast cancer. What we see here usually, if you look closely and you look at the publications, is that these are really proofs of concept using data from one single source and so forth. These are not actual products. And once these systems are tested on different data sets, usually the performance just really vanishes. And we have this translational gap between the proofs of concept and actual products, clinical adaptation of actual products. And this is what this framework is about, to really give an idea what to do to bridge this gap. Next slide. And how can we bridge this gap? Because there are lots that we can do, but in the end, what is product development? Product development is the transformation of a market opportunity and a set of assumptions about a product technology into a product available for sale. So this gap is, in essence, a product development gap. It's a problem of product development. And that's why we set out to kind of help solving this. Next slide, please. And we developed this framework, which has 3 phases, basically 3.5 phases. So the 3 phases for the product development itself is form. I have to read it from the tablet here because unfortunately I can't, it's not really showing well on my screen. So in the form phase, we basically start out with an idea. So usually it's a small team. It's around the perceived clinical needs, so something that somebody wants to solve. In this form phase, we check the technical feasibility, and we have to understand the potential way to the market. And the goal usually here is a proof of concept with which we go into the build phase, which in AI in healthcare, because we're in healthcare with clinical validation and regulation, can take a long time, can last up to 5 years. Team becomes bigger. We probably want to do validation, and a bit more validation. And really the goal here is to have a solid code base for the regulatory approval and a validated clinical need. And with this, we go into the launch phase, which means here you get regulation and here you get your proof that everything works, which means you have a product that you can sell, which is followed then by, and that's the half, is the post-market with software updates, changing clinical practices and surveillance. But what are now, next slide please, the important things for these 3 phases, which are the 4 domains that we identified. And this is the clinical domain, where we have to do everything that resolves around the clinical validation of the product. It's the regulatory domain. Here, everything that is with regards to the regulation, so the medical device regulation law, how to prepare for that. Data, it's pretty clear what kind of data do you need for each of the phases. And of course, which algorithms should you do and how should you do algorithmic development? If you go to the next slide, one of the really important things were that we focused on two things. In every phase, you actually face two things. What is it that you'd have to do now, which is really important to actually be able to proceed to the next phase? However, you also want to do things to deleverage the risks also already for the next phase. Now we will walk you, next slide please, through the three phases and the 4 domains, as briefly as possible. I will cover the clinical and the data domain, and David will cover the regulatory and algorithmic domain. So we will switch a bit, and David will continue doing the slide DJ, being the slide DJ. Okay, so we're in the form phase. So remember, we just set out. So we can really see this as we just start out. Let's say we're in a university setting and we just had a really cool idea, and maybe it's still within the limits of the university. Maybe we're an incubator. So what is it that you want to do in such a form phase to be able to proceed to further phase, and what's it that you want to do now? First of all, you really have to define your clinical need. You want to show here that you might be able to solve it by a proof of concept. And very importantly, you want to validate. So validation is so important that you're not stuck to, this is how we're going to solve it. And you're going to hear this a lot also in the upcoming phase, but it's really, validation is really the key. But very importantly, what is it that you want to validate? And here, I think David and I shared the experience talking to potential co-founders of startups, also others. There is the threat that people perceive something that they think should be solved as a clinical need that actually will lead to a product which people pay for. That there can be a very, very big gap between a pet idea that you have, it would be so good to solve this, so there could be a gap to something that is actually can become a product. And how can something become a product? And this is important. You either need to reduce costs, which is clear because people would love to buy things that actually reduce costs in the healthcare system. But the other way that you can go is a proven clinical benefit. And I think here's a big misunderstanding by people outside of healthcare what a proven clinical benefit means. This really means that you have to get into the guidelines. You have to force clinicians to use this, because otherwise you just increase costs and it will not work. You cannot, just because something is promising, it doesn't mean that the whole world will say, oh, this is great, we're going to use it. It costs a lot of money, but if it's great. No, you have to really prove this, and it has to have a proven clinical benefit getting into the clinical guidelines.
Over to me, I guess.
Yep.
So one thing I want to make clear here is we typically are using the language of medicine here. And it's fairly obvious why a medical product should be regulated. What's less obvious to people is that if you make any claims whatsoever, even if they're only implied about health benefits, then you should expect to be regulated. That's pretty much how the healthcare system works. That's how regulation works. We're region agnostic. We're saying in any well-developed economy, there's a regulatory system for this stuff. And you need to plan for that from the start. Part of the issue here is, so I think my video is not up, by the way, Vince. I think you're still on screen, possibly.
And people see me drinking. That's
possibly. So in healthcare, you typically get a higher sales price. Valuations are higher. And it's not always understood by outsiders that this is a reflection of the costs involved. This is not just profiteering. And so there is a deep body of work when you work in this space in order to get through the regulatory hurdles. And that's the real reason that you're able to charge higher prices for your product. And it's the reason that your company has a higher valuation. The main thing in form is to accept that you're probably going to fall under a regulatory framework. If you can at least accept that, you can begin to plan. You don't have to make the plans fully in the first part, but you need to at least have thought about it and say that by the second phase, we're already going to be regulated in some form or other, and we need to start to think about it today. Vince.
Okay, I fixed my problem here, so I don't need to look at the tablet anymore. So the data domain. Now, importantly, we're still in the form phase, so we just started out, and it's very, very unlikely that you will have any data at this stage which will be useful in the upcoming stages. You might even have actually no data at all, but let's assume that you somehow got hands on a data set that actually helps you to develop this proof of concept. And in this stage, it's totally okay if that data is biased. What does bias mean here? It could be just from one university, it could be just from one scanner, it could be even only a subset of the disease that you actually want to cover. This is fine, it's fine in this stage. You should just be aware of the fact that this data is probably by itself useless in the upcoming stages. However, it should not be as biased that you actually cannot show that the proof of concept might solve the actual clinical need that you have identified. And very importantly, remember, this is what you should do. What you should also do is to deleverage the risks for the next phases. And one of them is you need a data plan. You should really take the time, sit down, and really think about, okay, what kind of data will I need in the upcoming phases to get rid of the bias? How many different data sources do I need? How many manufacturers are there? Let's assume you work with MRI images for certain kinds. How many manufacturers are there? How do I make sure that I get different types of sequences from different manufacturers, from different places, so that I can really have a product in the end that is applicable everywhere? You can have a great product, but if it works only on Philips scanners and in the whole of Germany, people usually use Siemens scanners, then you just lost one market just because your system only works in a certain type of scanner. And if you don't know that, then you're basically screwed. You might actually launch in Germany realizing, oh, nobody's gonna buy it here, and you're done.
Right, so we're largely speaking a tech audience here, so we can be reasonably technical. But you also have to understand, we're not going to go into the detail of which algorithm to use because it's different for every particular application. The most important thing I have to say in the first phase of the project is it's very tempting to be overly optimistic about how well your algorithm is performing. It's very tempting to tweak it and tune it and get the absolute perfect performance on your trial data, on your early data set. This is very much a false promise. And unless you want to work on something for 5 to 10 years that ultimately doesn't make it to market, a little bit of self-honesty is very, very valuable at this point. You really internally need to understand how well your algorithms work on the data set, but you also need to understand how much effort you put into bringing it that far and, in a sense, the limitations of that data set. Something I really strongly push on teams that I mentor is they should formalize their benchmarks early in the process. So what I mean by this is, some of you from a software development point of view might know of test-driven development. I want to consider a similar process for statistics, where you write some scripts which you run on your training data, and they have various benchmarks that they set. So this is the mean, this is the variance of particular columns, and you formalize in code what your hypotheses are about the data. And you run these when you change the data sets. And this becomes more and more important when you start changing the input representations, when you start amalgamating things into shared columns and so on. If there's something about your theory about the data that has changed, you need to pick up on that rather than spend a few weeks or a few months tuning, only to find out that your entire performance wandered just because you changed something in the pre-processing. Finally, at this early stage, it's totally fine to try out many techniques. In fact, with some teams, I strongly encourage it. With others, it's so obvious that they're in the visual processing domain that there are only one or two techniques, and it's really about getting those things working well. But, and this is from the managerial point of view, you should be thinking about which techniques can be deployed in the actual solution context. So if things need to be very, very fast real-time processing, then it probably needs to be some kind of sparser model. Most ML models can, of course, be tuned and can be optimized, but still you should be thinking about ones which can take the relevant throughput of data and respond in a timely manner. And so then we go on to build. Vince.
Yes, so we start again with clinical validation domain. So we're now in the build phase, and we said in the beginning this can take actually a long time, especially in the healthcare domain. Now, what's very important, especially when time passes, is that you continuously re-evaluate and fine-tune your clinical need. It can actually happen that the clinical reality changes a little bit or even a lot. New results come in, and actually how patients are treated in a certain clinical setting changes. So that actually might change your clinical need. And it actually can make your clinical need even obsolete, then you're really unlucky. But let's say it just changes slightly, so you need to really be prepared for that. What can also happen is that actually really, really big assumptions about what you're going to do will actually change. So you will actually, at a certain point, maybe even develop a different product than you set out to do. This is, I would even say, normal. It's nothing bad. It is good. So change will happen, and change is good. You really should embrace this and really have this validation mindset. Let's get out, be open to what is basically gonna happen. Very importantly, however, while this is happening, make sure that your technical team is involved. Make sure that the technical solution and the clinical need are aligned. Nothing is won if you actually have validated clinical need, changed it, but you never communicated it to the technical people, and they still worked on old data, or you changed your clinical need, but you didn't have data for that. You still developed something, and then you hope to somehow get into the third phase with a solution that is actually not solving the clinical need. That will not work out. People realize when you bullshit, and it will not work. So try to not bullshit anyone. Be aware of bias is something that we just repeat every time where it's remotely fitting, because this is really, really one of the most important things. A bias system will not show clinical efficacy. It's just a waste of time and money. And also here, like with the data, to keep track of all these changes and what is necessary, have a validation plan, have a clinical validation plan, so that you really know at what time what needs to be done, and to be prepared also for the next phases. So for example, in the next phase, you will have to prove that what you found works. So at this phase, you can already have a clinical validation plan and reach out to a clinical research organization or university. Just reach out, have some ties, have some contacts already, so that immediately once you get to the launch phase, you can start. And it doesn't make sense to start in the launch phase. Okay, now we have to conduct a study. How do we do that actually? So have some idea already in the build phase how you will proceed.
Okay, so like I said, I'm happy in the first phase in form if you just understand that you are going to be regulated. Ideally, you come up with a plan there already, but this is the phase, the build phase, where you have to get serious about it. It is, like Vince said in the clinical section, it's a good idea to start making plans for what you're going to do later. But also here, we're talking now also on the software side and on the machine learning side. At some point in the build phase, you have to be deeply, deeply involved in a clinically regulated, certifiable process for software development. So the first thing I'd say here is what you're building is called a medical device. It falls under medical device legislation right now. This applies, like I said, even at the lower end of the spectrum. If you're making an app for yoga, there is a good chance that you will be regulated under those particular rules. This is hard work following these rules, and it leads to a significant trade-off in where you're going to put your focus at any different time. And what I mean by that is, in particular, when you think of it from a software development point of view, there's one extreme where you have modern consumer-oriented approaches, which we typically put under the umbrella terms of agile and lean startup, where you try and race to the consumer and then you adapt until you find what works. In this space, there are certain products you can still do that as long as you do it in a safe manner. So perhaps you have content and it's all been already editorialized, it's been certified, it's probably safe content, and you're just trying to figure out how to present it better to people. This is at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of risk. Great. So you can do some playing within that framework. But if you start opening up the access to who gets to publish on your platform, then you've changed the risk profile completely. And you probably can no longer do that in such an agile manner. In general, what we see is that most teams in this phase move from, yes, a very agile approach initially to something that's closer to waterfall by the end of the process. And in particular, at some point, you need a quality management system where you document in detail what you've done and why you make changes to the code. Why did you upgrade the version of Python? You actually have to justify that. So then the final point I want to say in this phase is, in general, I'm pushing people to do more UI and UX testing. I push it because it makes your product better, but it also falls under this regulatory umbrella. So people are going to use your product, at least we hope they are, if it gets on the market. And there are all kinds of assumptions then in how they use it. And the regulatory framework will look into that as well. If you can think of the case where you design your software for the ICU and you design it with expert doctors in mind and you test it on them, don't forget that nurses also work in the ICU. What will they understand from the interface that is different from what the doctor understands? There's been a long history in medicine of people of different categories in the hierarchy switching off alarms because it kept beeping all night. I didn't know what to do with it. This is something you actually have to bear in mind with your software and design it early in the process because it will be part of the regulatory bundle. Vince.
Yes, so the data domain. Now remember in the form phase, we wanted to develop a data plan. And in the build phase, you're going to follow this plan. So what you want to do is actually to collect external data sources representative of the wild. What do I mean by the wild is the real clinical setting. You want to get as many heterogeneous data sets as possible that in the end represent all different ways your clinical need is represented by data. So by different scanners, by different ways how, let's say if you talk about pathology, different ways how tissue can be processed, different ways how this tissue can be digitalized, so basically photographed. All this is very, very important that for each of these users, you have data which represents their data, because otherwise they will buy your product, but will try to use it on their data and it will not work. And this is really, especially in the sometimes relatively small markets that you can have for certain products, if one person goes to the next conference and tells all his buddies, oh, listen, that software from those guys, that was really shit, then basically you're out of the market. And this is something that you don't want to happen. Importantly, depending on your clinical need, data collection could mean that you actually need to run a study just simply for data collection. Do not confuse this study with a study to validate actually your product later. So in the worst case, and this contributes to the long time of build, in the worst case, it could mean that for your product, you actually need to run, I would even say, at least 2 studies over the course of several years. And this is a very, very big challenge for products like this. At the end of the build phase, your data must one-to-one reflect the real-world conditions of the use cases, basically the summary of this slide.
Nice. So, I mean, there's a lot of interlacing between our different points here. What I would say here from the algorithmic point of view is build is where you get serious about things. So I would say this is the industrialization of data processing. So machine learning, yes, it's fun to play with these tools in an academic context to fit some things, write a paper about how well you fitted such and such a data set. But at some point, and in the industrial world, it's a real heavy duty industrial process at this point. So most teams, I find, tend to rewrite their code at this point. So whatever you've done in form informs what you do in build, but often you throw out most of it and you have pretty senior software developers come in and rewrite it at this point. So I said in the first part in form that you should have metrics, you should formalize your hypotheses, all this kind of stuff. I want to make it really clear that metrics here are not for holding people in your team to account. And you run a risk here if you do that, that ultimately people will hide stuff. So I've managed many teams in this space. You need the metrics to be recognized within the team as a method of figuring out something that changed in your processes. And you can't afford for people to be hiding this kind of stuff. Otherwise, you will eventually have the more talented people leave the team and the less talented ones will stay, and they will turn a blind eye to all the things that don't work, and you will wonder later on why your clinical trials didn't work out. Related to the formalization of hypotheses and the metrics, you should be checking your basic assumptions repeatedly. And of course, you can't formalize all of them in code, but you should be checking back with your data regularly to see, well, now that we've expanded it from in-house data to some kind of multi-center data, we got our buddies in Heidelberg, we got some guy in Paris to contribute data. Does it still look the same? If we use the original trained model, does it give similar performance when we try it out on the new data set? Various statistical questions about the data, do they still hold true or not? And then related very strongly to what Vince said on the clinical slide, does your algorithm do what it's supposed to do at this point? So it's very easy when you learn to do ML well, you become quite adept with transforming the problem. And we do it particularly well on the input. So you tend to flip the data, you look at it in a different way, and suddenly it's much easier to train a model. But we sometimes let that behavior slide into what we're predicting as well. And there's a history of this because in the early days of using machine learning in industry, it kind of didn't matter what we were trying to predict. As long as you could predict something reliably, somebody else could figure out how to monetize that. Well, we're in the health space here, and probably what you're trying to predict is very precise, and it's that thing and that thing only. So it's adverse events in the next 24 hours. It's not, yeah, this person's probably not very healthy right now. And the difference between these are paradigm shifting in terms of how the person's treated, but also in terms of the valuation behind your model. So that is the build phase. We're going to move on now to the launch phase, at which point you've got a prototype, and we go back to Vince.
Absolutely. So what will happen here is, so basically the clinical launch phase is basically the final clinical validation. As we said before, I mentioned before, without a proven clinical efficacy, be it to reduce costs, or be it to actually improve the outcome of patients and get to the guidelines, you have basically no customers. And now comes something that might come to some as controversial, although David and I have discussed it a lot, and in the end we decided it's not controversial at all. When you look at what you want to achieve, is that to really show this unequivocally, we will probably, in the overwhelming majority, have to run a randomized clinical trial, which is also possible for individualized prediction, which often happens as part of precision medicine when you actually use machine learning / AI. Now, this is very, very important because this is something that you need to prepare for, that you will actually have to run a randomized clinical trial, which is not an easy thing to do, which can take a lot of time, and which is very easy to do badly. And then you actually have invested so much time and resources to build something to test it and you failed during the last step. You probably don't want that. So good trial design is crucial. So really work with experts here. And it might be advisable to actually work with a contract research organization that really does nothing else than running clinical trials for customers.
Yeah, so in the regulatory context in the launch phase, one of the things we debated about was, should we just call it the regulatory or clinical trial phase? So it is very much a regulatory phase in particular, and we couldn't find a way to make a framework without having this pause in time. You have all this play before where you make a project, where you put things together. You have to test it, and we couldn't find ways around it. We weren't completely in agreement at the start, but we really couldn't find ways around this. Whether you do a clinical trial or not is negotiable, but it's pretty likely. And I know that from personal experience, even at the low end of the risk scale here in Germany, that clinical trials need to be run. So the first thing you're going to find out, and if you look at our framework in detail, did you plan this phase correctly? Because if you didn't, things are going to get crazily expensive. And you should have planned it before now, as Vince mentioned way at the start of the talk. So you have a lot of time to do preparatory work. It's for the more managerial members of the team. The machine learners are super busy in the first two phases. At this, so the other guys, yes, you have to do fundraising. Yes, you have to manage people, but you also really have to take care of your homework on the regulatory phase before you reach this point. The goal here is that you will have a certified medical device at the end of this phase. That's the purpose. And under the regulatory framework, but preparing for your market entry, you also need to have a plan for how to handle post-launch surveillance. I'm going to talk about what that is in the actual post-market phase, but you need to have this plan in place for how you're going to track things that go wrong in your program when it's in the wild. And you also need to have a plan for how to do software updates. And these will probably form part of the package, the regulatory package. Again, this is a very new area in terms of regulations. The regulations are not super solid on specifics, but it's pretty obvious at this point if certain things are just going to be necessary. And now we move on to data.
Yes, so generally in this phase is usually, so it's written here, and it is true that it's the final time where your team might get new data. It's not what happens usually, because usually the data that is collected in the clinical trial is to show how well your product or your preliminary product works. So usually it won't happen. In the case that you actually didn't do things right and previous data was not reflecting the use case, then it might be that it's possible to do some fine-tuning with backtesting, showing that with the changes, actually the predictions wouldn't have changed. And if they actually really didn't change, you might be able to actually get through regulation, or maybe even to show that your product is working. But there are many open questions exist. So here the data phase is really, if you really need to collect data in this phase, you have done something seriously wrong before in the previous stages, and your whole endeavor is really, really in danger.
Next.
Sorry?
Yep, next, me. Yep, sorry. It's not a good DJ. Okay, so look, form and build are exciting from a machine learning point of view. This particular phase is a dangerous one for the machine learning team. I've seen a couple of companies lay off their entire machine learning team in this phase. I think that's really, really terrible behavior by the founders. I also think it's ridiculously bad planning, and it's probably as a result of not having a clear pathway to market in mind. They didn't know what to do with the team at this phase. It was obvious that you're going to have a year or more of a clinical trial. Why would I pay all these expensive salaries? Ideally, you should be thinking about this in advance, and you should be figuring out other things to do with the team. So the obvious thing that bigger companies do is they move the team to work on a follow-up product. And this is part of a platform approach. So something to understand in the AI and healthcare space is that most applications of AI in this space, you know, having one tool is not great. So I've got the perfect tool for detecting a specific type of small population carcinoma in a particular type of CT scan. Great, but where does that fit into the clinical workflow? How can we possibly leverage this into the clinic unless it's going to lead to, in some way, much better outcomes for people? And unless you can really get it into the workflows, the most obvious thing to do here is to take over an entire part of the pipeline where you actually can work on hundreds of indications. And at that point, things become interesting, and suddenly you've got a real AI company. So larger companies at least can switch tasks. I would say that, look, in your worst case scenario, if you're already entering this phase and you still have a team, insights from out of sample data are actually really relevant still, particularly if you're going for a high value product here. So out of sample is this kind of data where you weren't using it for training and you somehow got it in the clinical trial. So you control the clinical trial. You can ask for a copy of the data. You probably can't retrain the model on that data and then use the new version to go to market, unless in certain caveat cases. But you can at least test out the new data and see what's different about it. So if your performance was slightly lower in the clinical trial than in your in-house testing, in your expectations, why was it lower? You can look at this, and perhaps with certain regulators, you can even argue for an updated model on the basis of your introspection into the model at that point. So this is something a machine learning team can bring a lot of value to. There's also a real strong ethical, and I would also say legal implication here, that if you don't properly analyze the outcome of the clinical trial and it's shown later that through your negligence bad things happened and it would have been detectable at that phase, then there's a pretty high likelihood that you're liable and that your company is liable. Lower hanging fruit that the team can also work on, because these are tech people. The most important thing here is shifting medical standards. So for those of us in machine learning, that's non-stationarity of the data. That means that when doctors prescribe things, when doctors make diagnoses rather, the diagnostic criteria change over time. And it's not like there's a form that's filled out every time that says, well, from today forward, we switch to the new criteria. There are attempts to do it in such a formal manner, but you know, the doctor working in research at the Charité here in Berlin is very different from the Hausarzt in a small village in Thüringen. And when they update their clinical practices in terms of how they diagnose things, leaves a lot to be desired from a standardization of data point of view. Also then the surveillance and the software updates, your team can at least contribute to these particular topics. And I'm going to come back to them now in the next section. So I guess I will continue, because you've passed your clinical trials, you've gone to market, you can sell like crazy now. There's just three very strong things from a tech point of view that you really shouldn't forget about. And these are super important. So the first is software updates. So yes, software is great. You can update it live. You can push updates, Firefox updates in the background. It was one of the first to do that automatically. It's great. But your new version of the software has not been certified. It's not been through a clinical trial. So for minor updates, it's usually possible through negotiations with the regulatory body to do a real update, to really push something without doing a clinical trial. But you have to specify what's minor versus what's major in terms of updates to your code, in terms of retraining the model, these kind of things. And how you do it is also relevant. I mean, there is basically a growing trend towards cyber attacks, and your update mechanism could also be hijacked, and you need to be really careful about that. The second issue is the stationarity of the data, so shifting clinical practices. If the diagnostic standard changes every 2 years, then your machine learning model has a lifetime of 2 years. and you need to have a plan of how you're going to update it. So it's kind of crazy to spend an awful lot of money getting people to manually tag data today if you realize that it changes on average every 2 to 3 years. Then you're going to have to repeat that process every 2 to 3 years. You need a plan on how to do that. And ideally, you need to detect the changes as they're happening in the wild and then quickly adapt to deal with them. And the final one, and it's actually the most important of the lot, is surveillance. So surveillance is the pharma term for detecting when a drug goes bad. So what happens when my doctor gives me a pill and I have an adverse reaction to it? Usually, my doctor has to fill out a form and they send it to the local Gesundheitsamt, who then decide what to do with that form. And eventually it goes through various offices, and pretty quickly, I have to say, it ends up on the desk of somebody in the pharma company who made that particular drug. And on both the government side and on the pharma side, there are agencies looking and deciding what the risk is. Is this the only case where this has ever happened? Okay, well, it's been prescribed millions of times. It's probably not really down to this drug. Versus it's a new drug on the market. He was one of the first guys to get it and he died. Okay, then we really have to intervene and intervene fast. You're in that environment here. And yes, for the low risk class products, there's probably very little you need to worry about here, but you still need to have processes in place. And just to be really clear, because we're in the creepy space of online app, all this kind of stuff, surveillance has, of course, a tracking component. Automated tracking in healthcare apps is a sensitive issue. Most of your customers are probably not going to be happy if you stream telemetry over their hospital network back to your servers. So be very careful about the decisions you make about surveillance. It may well be a pen and paper process, and you're just going to have to live with that and pay the associated costs with supporting that. Right, so wrapping up, we just have a couple of final points and then we'll probably go to questions. So look, it's a huge achievement if you can bring one of these products to market. And really, congratulations to anyone who succeeds. There really are very, very few products on the market so far. I mean, it's vanishingly close to zero. But there are a few that are at least through the regulations. They just don't seem to have made much traction yet. Our goal with the framework, it's to be practical in particular. It's to be somewhat universal, meaning we should be applicable in most countries here. We don't want to say, yes, this is the regulatory process in Germany, and this is the FDA exception, and here's the Japan rule. That part is moving too fast, and honestly, neither of us wants to work in that field, so we will leave that to the experts. You can pay them a lot of money to give you particular specific advice about the market you're going into. What I wanted originally, and I think what one of the things Vince wanted as well, is we've got 4 tables, 4 A4 pages at the end of our article. In essence, I think founders should be printing those and putting them on the wall. They should be sleeping with them on the bedside. They're not perfect, but it's such a spider web of interconnections. So we've artificially separated it into 4 domains. We've separated into 3 distinct timelines. We think the timeline matches the appropriate timeline from both a funding and a team perspective. We think it's pretty natural. And of course, most teams have not hit on this timeline automatically, but they get there eventually. And that's particularly important here from the point of view of funding. So most funding for this space right now, that we're aware of at least, is pitched on the idea that digital is cheap, digital is innovative, we can turn things around quickly. I mean, I kind of wanted to do that when I got into the space, but it's just so obvious very quickly that the risks outweigh the benefits, and you cannot run before you can walk in this space. So we're kind of hoping that through reading of the framework, through adoption of it, that also both government and investor funding will switch a light bulb and they'll say, okay, this is not Instagram, this is biotech. I need to have my biotech hat on when I'm investing in this space, and I need to fund it appropriately. And the final thing here is about clinical validation. So Vince mentioned it briefly. We did quite a negotiation amongst ourselves, quite a debate about the necessity of clinical trials. What we realized in the end was most of what we hear in this environment, in this space, about people saying, oh, you don't really need an RCT, a randomized clinical trial, randomized control trial. Most of them were trying to use the argument that you need real world data instead, and that you can gather this observational data, and there's this exception in FDA rules, and because of that, you can use this as evidence that your system is safe. It's not true. So particularly to the point of the FDA exception, the FDA exception for real world data is opening up a path for drugs to be used for other illnesses. So you've got a drug that's already been approved for Alzheimer's, and somebody discovers that it's very good for a particular population and their heart condition. Then you can show that, well, look, we've already done the safety work for Alzheimer's, we've done all of this stuff, and now, so that's your real world data. It's safe in these people, and even it's shown that these people have less heart attacks, then maybe we'll expand the prescription rules and allow it to also be used for heart conditions. That's the meaning of it in the law as it stands. And I would say as a statistician that I can't see too many cases where you're going to be able to use real world data to validate an AI model. They're the same thing at that point. Your post hoc analysis of the data is what the AI machine was built on. You're going to have to argue very hard with me to convince me that there is a use case where you get to use the data you brought to the table in order to prove your model. So I think on that point, we say good luck with starting your companies, all of you. Good luck with building your machine learning models in AI in healthcare. We're going to enjoy the ride. We're going to continue trying ourselves. I'll hand control back to Nico to maybe moderate things after this.